Welcome back to another journey into the depths of Final Fantasy VII lore. Today we're exploring one of the most intriguing questions that emerges when you really start analyzing the timeline and events of this legendary game. Did the Shinra Electric Power Company know about the existence of the weapons before Sephiroth summoned Meteor? It seems like a straightforward question at first, but as we'll discover, the answer is far more complex and fascinating than you might expect. When most players experience Final Fantasy VII for the first time, the weapons appear suddenly and catastrophically after Cloud hands over the black materia in the northern crater. These colossal biomechanical titans burst from their Mako cocoons, creating shockwaves that reshape the entire narrative. For the player, it's a moment of shock and awe, massive creatures unlike anything we've encountered before, embodiments of the planet's rage and desperation. But here's where things get interesting. Professor Hojo, standing in that very crater, makes a statement that seems to contradict evidence found elsewhere in the game's expanded universe. He looks at these awakening behemoths and says something that caught the attention of every lore enthusiast. He didn't believe they existed. He thought they were legend. Yet if we dig deeper into the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, the extended universe of games, films and supplementary materials, we find evidence suggesting that Shinra had encountered at least one weapon decades before Meteor ever became a threat. The contradiction is stark and demands investigation. How could the company's head scientists claim complete disbelief when Shinra had apparently discovered a dormant weapon years earlier? Was Hojo lying? Did different departments within Shinra keep secrets from each other? Or is there something more nuanced happening with how information flowed through this massive corporate entity? To properly unravel this mystery, we need to understand not just what Shinra knew, but how they knew it, when they learned it, and why that information might have been suppressed, compartmentalized or misunderstood. We'll need to examine ancient Cetra texts that spoke of these planetary guardians, trace the research of scientists like Professor Gast, who studied the ancients and their legends, explore the discovery made beneath Benora village during mining operations, and analyze how corporate secrecy and political maneuvering might have kept crucial information from reaching even high-ranking executives like Rufus Shinra. This investigation will take us from the dawn of Cetra civilization 2,000 years before the game's events, through decades of Shinra's secretive research programs, and into the modern era where new evidence from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth adds even more layers to this already complex puzzle. We'll examine contradictory statements, explore the reliability of different sources, and attempt to construct a timeline that makes sense of all the available evidence. The stakes of understanding this question go beyond mere trivia. If Shinra knew about the weapons, if they understood that the planet possessed these ultimate defense mechanisms, it fundamentally changes how we interpret their actions throughout the game. Did President Shinra truly not understand the consequences of draining the planet's Mako? Did the company's military strategists account for potential planetary retaliation when planning their operations? When Hojo continued his twisted experiments and Scarlet developed ever more powerful weapons, did they do so with knowledge that they might be provoking forces beyond human comprehension? The weapons themselves represent one of Final Fantasy VII's most compelling concepts, the planet as a living, conscious entity capable of defending itself. Unlike the summons that can be called by materia, the weapons are not servants or tools, they are autonomous extensions of planetary will, massive engines of destruction designed to eliminate threats to the planet's survival. Understanding what Shinra knew about them helps us understand the game's central conflict between industrial exploitation and environmental preservation in new and deeper ways. So, let's begin our investigation at the beginning, with the very creation of these legendary guardians. To understand what Shinra might have known about the weapons, we first need to understand what there was to know, the true history of these planetary defenders, how they came into being, and why they lay dormant for 2 millennia before awakening in our hero's time. The weapon's origins and purpose. When the planet created its guardians 2,000 years before Cloud Strife ever picked up a sword, the world of Gaia experienced a cataclysm that would shape its destiny forever. From somewhere in the vast darkness of space, a meteor came hurtling toward the planet, and within that meteor was something that defied natural categorization, an alien intelligence called Genova. The impact site of Genova's arrival would later be known as the Northern Crater, a massive wound in the planet's surface that has never fully healed even in the present day of Final Fantasy VII. Understanding what happened when Genova arrived is crucial to understanding why the weapons exist. The creature that emerged from that crater was unlike anything the inhabitants of Gaia had encountered. Genova possessed horrifying abilities. It could read minds, shape-shifting into the forms of loved ones to infiltrate communities of Cetra. It carried what the ancients called a virus. Whether this was truly a biological pathogen or something more metaphysical remains debated, but its effects were undeniable. Cetra, infected by Genova's presence, transformed into monstrosities. Their bodies and minds corrupted beyond recognition. The Cetra, also known as the Ancients, were the planet's caretakers. They possessed an intimate connection with the lifestream, able to hear the planet's voice and guide its spiritual energy to cultivate life across the world's surface. They were wanderers by nature, migrating from place to fulfill their role as planetary stewards. When Genova arrived, the Cetra represented the greatest concentration of life and consciousness on Gaia, making them the primary target for this alien horror. The planet itself, being a living entity in the metaphysics of Final Fantasy VII, could sense the mortal threat Genova represented. The alien wasn't just killing Cetra, it was threatening the fundamental integrity of the planet's lifestream, the spiritual energy that sustained all life. In response to this existential danger, the planet did something it had perhaps never done before and might never do again. It autonomously spawned defensive organisms specifically designed for warfare. These became known as the weapons. According to Professor Gast's research, which Hojo would later cite, at the northern crater, the weapons were monsters created by the planet that appear when the planet is in danger, reducing everything to nothingness. This description captures their essential nature perfectly. The weapons are not like other creatures on Gaia. They don't eat, reproduce, or follow natural life cycles. They exist solely as instruments of planetary defense, massive biomechanical constructs that blur the line between living organism and environmental force. The exact number of weapons created during that ancient crisis varies depending on which source we consult. In the original Final Fantasy VII, 5 weapons awaken when Meteor is summoned. Ultimate Weapon, Diamond Weapon, Sapphire Weapon, Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon. The extended universe introduces additional weapons. Jade Weapon appears in Before Crisis, while Omega Weapon serves as the final threat in Dirge of Cerberus. Each possesses unique characteristics and apparent elemental affinities, suggesting they were designed with different defensive roles in mind. The weapons were, by all accounts, devastatingly effective at their intended purpose. Ultimate Weapon could fly freely through the atmosphere, raining destruction from above. Emerald Weapon was adapted for deep ocean combat, nearly invincible beneath the waves. Ruby Weapon could burrow through desert sands. Diamond Weapon possessed nearly impenetrable armor and could march across continents. Each was powerful enough to level cities, and together they represented an apocalyptic force capable of scouring Gaia clean of any threat. But here's where the story takes its crucial turn. The weapons were never actually used against Genova. Before these planetary guardians could be fully deployed, the surviving Cetra managed to accomplish something extraordinary. Through methods that are never fully explained, perhaps through their connection to the lifestream, perhaps through some ancient magic, they succeeded in sealing Genova within the northern crater. The alien was contained, frozen in a geological stratum, where it would remain in stasis for the next 2,000 years. With Genova neutralized, the threat that had called the weapons into being was effectively eliminated. The planet, recognizing that its ultimate defenders were no longer needed, did something fascinating. Rather than destroying the weapons or allowing them to continue existing in an active state, it preserved them. They were mixed with natural Mako, crystallized lifestream, and placed into suspended animation within the northern crater itself, in spite of Genova's arrival and imprisonment. This preservation was not random or careless. The planet was in essence keeping its weapons in reserve. The weapons were positioned like sentinels, watching over Genova's prison. Should the alien threat ever re-emerge, or should any comparable danger arise, they would be ready to awaken and respond. They remained there, visible within enormous Mako cocoons, their faces emerging from crystallized spiritual energy, waiting with inhuman patience for a call to action that might never come. The decision to preserve rather than destroy the weapons tells us something important about how the planet functions. It suggests a kind of long-term strategic thinking, an ability to anticipate that threats might recur. The planet that created the weapons was looking ahead across vast stretches of time. Understanding that while this particular crisis had been resolved, the fundamental vulnerability that necessitated creating such defenders might arise again. During those 2,000 years of dormancy, the world changed dramatically. The Cetra civilization, already devastated by their war against Genova, dwindled to near extinction. Those Cetra who had chosen to abandon their wandering lifestyle and settle in permanent communities, gradually lost their connection to the planet, their descendants becoming what we would recognize as regular humans. The knowledge of what had truly happened, the war against an alien invader, the sealing of Genova, the creation of the weapons, faded from living memory into myth and legend. By the time Shinra Electric Power Company rose to dominance through their exploitation of Mako energy, almost all concrete knowledge of the weapons had been lost. What little remained existed in fragments. Ancient Cetra texts that most people couldn't read, oral traditions that had been distorted over countless retellings, ruins and artifacts whose true significance had been forgotten. The weapons themselves continued their vigil in the northern crater, dormant and invisible to the world that had grown up around them. It's crucial to understand that the weapons don't awaken based on any single, simple trigger. They were designed to respond to existential threats to the planet itself. When Sephiroth summons Meteor, the ultimate destructive magic capable of wounding the planet so severely that it might never recover, Ismail weapons perceive this as exactly the kind of apocalyptic scenario they were created to prevent. The summon of Meteor represents a threat comparable to Genova's original arrival, and so the ancient defensive protocols activate after 2 millennia of silence. But the weapons aren't sophisticated enough to distinguish between different types of threats or to identify specific culprits. When they awaken in Final Fantasy VII, they can't sense Sephiroth himself because he's erected an energy barrier around his location in the crater. Unable to reach the actual source of the meteor threat, the weapons do what they were designed to do. They target the most obvious sources of planetary damage they can detect. This means attacking the massive Mako reactors in Junon and Midgar, the largest concentrations of industrial lifestream extraction on the planet. From the weapons perspective, Shinra's Mako reactors probably appear very similar to what Genova represented, foreign entities that are draining the planet's life force. The reactors are quite literally sucking spiritual energy out of the ground, processing it into a commodity and preventing that energy from flowing through the planet's natural cycles. To a being created specifically to eliminate threats to planetary health, Shinra's entire industrial infrastructure is indistinguishable from a cancer. This creates one of Final Fantasy VII's most fascinating moral ambiguities. The weapons are acting exactly as designed. They're defending the planet from real threats to its survival. But from humanity's perspective, they're monsters attacking civilian populations. Sapphire weapons assault on Junon. Diamond weapons march on Midgar. These aren't acts of evil, they're the planet's immune response to what it perceives as a lethal infection. The fact that humans live in these cities, that people will die when the weapons attack, are simply irrelevant to beings that exist on a planetary scale of consciousness. Understanding this context, the weapons as ultimate environmental safeguards, dormant for millennia, awakening only in response to threats that could destroy the planet itself, helps us appreciate why knowledge of their existence would be so significant. If Shinra knew about the weapons, they knew they were playing with forces that existed on a completely different scale than anything their military could handle. They knew that their actions might provoke a response from the planet itself, and that such a response would be utterly beyond human ability to resist or control. So what did the ancient Cetra write about these defenders? How was that knowledge preserved or lost? And what would someone like Professor Gast, diving deep into Cetra history in his research, have learned about the weapons from ancient sources? Let's explore the fragmentary records that survived 2,000 years of forgetting. Ancient knowledge, Cetra texts, and the loss of understanding. When we talk about what Shinra might have known about the weapons, we can't ignore the primary source of information about them, the Cetra themselves. The ancient texts and artifacts left by the ancients represent the only documentary evidence of the weapon's existence that predates modern times. But accessing that information, understanding it, and believing it all, presented significant challenges for the scientists and researchers who would eventually stumble upon these ancient records. The Cetra were not a writing-obsessed civilization in the way that modern humans are. Their primary mode of transmitting knowledge was oral tradition, and their intimate connection with the planet itself. The ancients could literally hear the planet's voice, could access the lifestream's memories in ways that seem almost miraculous to regular humans. In their society, there was less need for extensive written documentation, because knowledge could be directly transmitted through planetary communion. However, the Cetra did leave behind certain records. These took various forms: inscriptions on temple walls, information encoded in ancient machinery, texts that survived in fragments, and information embedded in special materia. The Temple of the Ancients, which plays a crucial role in Final Fantasy VII's plot, represents one such repository of Cetra knowledge. The ruins and sites scattered across the world, from the forgotten capital to various temples and shrines, all contain pieces of ancient wisdom. According to what we learn in the game, these Cetra texts and traditions did speak of the weapons. Yona, the last pure-blooded Cetra, knew of them. In her interviews with Professor Gast, she explained what the weapons were: the planet's defense mechanisms, created in response to Genova's arrival. But there's a crucial detail here. Even within Cetra knowledge, there seems to have been some ambiguity about exactly what the weapons were. The language used to describe the weapons in ancient texts appears to have been somewhat metaphorical or allegorical. This makes sense when you consider that the Cetra had a very different relationship with the planet than we do. For them, everything natural and supernatural was part of one continuous reality. The distinction between a real creature and a spiritual force would have been much less clear to them. When Cetra texts spoke of the weapons as the planets were made manifest, they meant that, quite literally, these were extensions of planetary consciousness given physical form. This ambiguity is actually vitally important to understanding why educated people in Final Fantasy VI's present day didn't believe in the weapons. When those ancient texts were eventually discovered and translated by researchers, the descriptions of the weapons sounded fantastical, mythological, exaggerated, talk of massive creatures that could reduce everything to nothingness, organisms created spontaneously by the planet itself, to scientifically minded people operating within a modern understanding of biology and physics. This all sounded like ancient people's way of describing natural disasters or metaphors for geological processes. Professor Gast Fareems, who served as head of Shinra's science department before his eventual departure from the company, was perhaps the most qualified person in the modern era to understand these ancient texts. Gast was a legitimate genius, a man whose intellect was acknowledged even by Hojo. His research into the Cetra was extensive and groundbreaking. He discovered Genova, identified her as what he believed to be an ancient, launched the Genova project, and later realized his catastrophic error after meeting Ifalna. In his research, Gast would have encountered references to the weapons. He documented this information in his reports. We know this because Hojo directly cites Professor Gast's report when explaining what the weapons are at the northern crater. Gast's report stated that the weapons were monsters created by the planet that appear when the planet is in danger, reducing everything to nothingness. This description, drawn from ancient Cetra sources and Ifalna's testimony, was sitting in Shinra's files. But here's the critical question. Did Gast believe what he was documenting? Did he think the weapons were literally real? Or did he consider them to be mythological constructs, useful for understanding Cetra belief systems, but not corresponding to actual biological entities? The evidence suggests Gast was probably unsure. He was documenting everything he learned about Cetra culture and history, including their stories about planetary defense mechanisms, but the fantastical nature of the claims would have given anyone pause. Consider what Gast was being asked to believe, that the planet, an astronomical body, was conscious and could spontaneously generate massive organisms designed for specific defensive purposes. In the modern scientific worldview, this sounds absurd. Even in a world where magic exists, where materia can summon powerful creatures, where lifestream is a known phenomenon, the specific claim that the planet itself could create living weapons strains credibility. Gast's position was probably similar to an archaeologist in our world, who uncovers ancient texts describing gods walking among mortals. The researcher dutifully documents what the texts say, analyzes them in cultural context, but doesn't necessarily believe the literal claims. The texts are valuable as historical and cultural artifacts, as windows into how ancient peoples understood their world, without necessarily being factual accounts of real events. This academic skepticism would have been even stronger among researchers who came after Gast, or who didn't share his deep immersion in Cetra studies. When B/U00 Jinhagen, the wise elder of Cosmo Canyon and one of the world's foremost planetologists, encounters references to the weapons in his research, he considers them to be myths and allegories. This is significant. B/U00 Jinhagen is someone who has dedicated his life to understanding the planet, who can sense the life stream in ways that approach the Cetra's ancient abilities, and even he thinks the weapons are legends rather than literal entities. The fact that someone like B/U00 Jinhagen, who is sympathetic to spiritual and environmental perspectives, who doesn't share Shinra's corporate materialism, still dismisses the weapons as myth tells us something important. It wasn't that only hardened scientists refused to believe in the weapons. Even those most inclined to trust ancient wisdom found the claims too fantastical. This suggests that the Cetra texts describing the weapons were fragmentary, ambiguous, or couched in language that made literal interpretation difficult. There's another layer of complexity here. The Cetra's own knowledge of the weapons may have been incomplete. Remember, the weapons were created in response to Genova but were never actually deployed in battle. The surviving Cetra sealed Genova before the weapons needed to act. This means that even ancient Cetra knowledge of what the weapons could do was probably theoretical. The texts might have described the planet's intention in creating them, their purpose, their enormous power, but there wouldn't have been detailed accounts of weapons in action, because that never happened. When information about the weapons filtered down through 2,000 years, passed from Setra to their descendants, translated and retranslated, fragmentary texts interpreted by people without the original cultural context, the resulting picture would have been confused and incomplete.
Some texts might have emphasized the weapons' role as protectors, others their destructive power. Still others might have treated them as more symbolic than literal. The city of the ancients, that hauntingly beautiful ruin where Aerith meets her fate, almost certainly contained information about the weapons, its architecture, its artifacts, the knowledge encoded in its very structure. All of this would have included references to the Great Crisis 2,000 years ago and the planetary response. But accessing that information required the ability to interface with ancient technology, with their language, to understand their conceptual frameworks. Without a living Setra to guide interpretation, much of what the city could have revealed remained hidden. Similarly, the Temple of the Ancients, which the party explores in their quest for the Black Materia, contained vast repositories of Setra knowledge. The temple itself was a kind of three-dimensional encyclopedia, its very architecture encoding information. B_U00 Fchenhagen visits the temple and is able to extract some knowledge from its systems, but even he admits he cannot fully read or understand everything the ancients left behind. The temple's guardians, those strange floating beings with beards, are themselves remnants of Setra culture, spirit forms left to protect ancient knowledge. What they could have told about the weapons, if anyone could communicate properly with them, remains unknown. This degradation and loss of knowledge is historically accurate to how civilizations actually work. When a culture declines or disappears, especially if that decline is sudden and catastrophic, information is lost. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the loss of Mayan astronomical knowledge, the forgetting of how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics before the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, all demonstrate how even important, well-documented information can become inaccessible when the cultural context that made it comprehensible is lost. For the Setra, this process would have been particularly severe because their culture was already in terminal decline when the texts about the weapons were created. The survivors of the Genova crisis were a traumatized remnant, their numbers devastated, their way of life shattered. The knowledge they tried to preserve about what had happened was recorded during, or immediately after, apocalyptic conditions. It's remarkable that any information survived at all, let alone enough for researchers like Gast to piece together a basic understanding of what occurred. The human descendants of the Setra, regular people who had lost the ability to commune with the planet, would have retained some oral traditions about the ancient crisis. These would have degraded into myths and legends over generations, stories about the time when the sky fell, when monsters came from the stars, when the ancients saved the world. In these folktales, the weapons might appear as legendary guardians or sleeping giants, elements of mythology rather than historical fact. When Shinra's researchers began uncovering Setra ruins and texts, they were attempting reverse archaeology, trying to reconstruct real history from legendary accounts, trying to separate fact from embellishment. Given how fragmentary and ambiguous the evidence was, different researchers would have reached different conclusions about what was literally true versus what was metaphorical or exaggerated. This brings us to a crucial point. Even if information about the weapons existed in Shinra's files, drawn from Gast's reports and other research into Setra texts, that information would not necessarily have been treated as describing real, currently existing threats. It would have been filed under ancient mythology, Setra belief systems, or historical legends. The notion that these creatures might actually be slumbering somewhere, waiting to awaken, would have seemed absurd to most people reviewing such files. This academic dismissal of ancient knowledge as mere myth is exactly the kind of hubris that Final Fantasy VII critiques throughout its narrative. The modern world, represented by Shinra's scientific materialism, believes it has surpassed the superstitions of the past. They're extracting spiritual energy. To power their cities, they've created super soldiers through genetic engineering. They're reaching towards space exploration. In their confidence, they've dismissed the ancient warnings as primitive people's fear of natural phenomena. But as the game repeatedly demonstrates, the ancient knowledge was correct. The planet is alive. The lifestream is the circulation of planetary consciousness. Genova was a real extraterrestrial threat. And yes, the weapons exist, not as symbols or metaphors, but as actual physical entities with the power to level cities. The hubris of modernity, believing itself superior to ancient wisdom, is precisely what allows catastrophe to occur. Yet this dismissal wasn't entirely unreasonable given the evidence available. Without encountering a weapon directly, without seeing one of these creatures with their own eyes, asking scientists and executives to believe in their existence based solely on fragmentary ancient texts, was asking a lot. The reports were there. The information was accessible. But it existed in a context that made it seem like mythology rather than actionable intelligence. This sets up our next crucial question. Did Shinra ever encounter physical evidence of the weapons? Did they ever move beyond ancient texts and legends to find actual proof that these creatures existed? The answer to that question lies buried beneath a small village in a hidden corner of the world. A discovery that changes everything about how we understand Shinra's knowledge of the weapons. The Ben-Aura discovery. When legend became reality. If our investigation stopped with ancient texts and academic reports, we might conclude that Shinra knew about the weapons only as myth and legend. But there's a problem with that conclusion. And it's a big one. Deep in the lore of Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII, we find evidence that Shinra didn't just read about a weapon in dusty old texts, they actually found one. The Ben-Aura region, located near Metal in the southern reaches of the world map, appears unremarkable at first glance. It's a rural area known primarily for the distinctive apples grown there, particularly the famous Ben-Aura white variety. Genesis Rhapsodos and Angeal Hughley, two of the key figures in Crisis Core's narrative, both hail from this village. On the surface, Ben-Aura seems like just another small agricultural community that Shinra largely ignored. But the village's true origin tells a very different story. According to official materials from the Crisis Core Complete Guide, Ben-Aura village was not a naturally evolved settlement. It was deliberately constructed by Shinra Electric Power Company to hide something they had discovered beneath the ground. Something so significant, and potentially alarming, that the company felt it necessary to build an entire fake town, staffed with Shinra employees, posing as residents to keep watch over it. What did Shinra find beneath Ben-Aura? The answer is documented clearly in multiples sources. A weapon. Specifically, a weapon that closely resembles Emerald Weapon, one of the massive guardians that would later awaken in response to Meteor. This weapon was discovered in stasis, preserved in crystallized Mako deep and underground caverns, exactly as the other weapons were preserved in the northern crater. The discovery occurred during mining operations. Shinra was always searching for new locations to site Mako reactors, and the Ben-Aura region was examined as one of many potential sites. Underground mines were built to assess the area's Mako potential and to extract resources. During these excavations, workers broke through into deeper cavern systems, and there, in the depths, they found the weapon. Imagine being the mining team that made that discovery. You're doing routine excavation work, following standard Shinra protocols for resource assessment, and suddenly you break through into a vast underground chamber. Your lights sweep across the space, and there, emerging from massive crystal formations, are the shoulders of something enormous. Something unlike anything in Shinra's extensive bestiary. Something that shouldn't exist according to modern understanding, but matches descriptions from ancient texts that most people dismissed as mythology. The weapon discovered at Ben-Aura is described in the Crisis Core Complete Guide as causing the Shinra Electric Power Company to immediately close the mining operation. This wasn't a gradual wind down or a temporary pause, it was an immediate shutdown. Whatever protocols existed for unusual discoveries must have been triggered, reports sent up through Shinra's chain of command, decisions made at high levels about how to respond to this finding. The decision was made to seal off the caverns containing the weapon, and to build Ben-Aura village above the discovery site. This was not a small or casual operation, building an entire village, staffing it with Shinran employees who would pose as residents, maintaining this fiction over years. This represents a significant investment of resources, and a serious commitment to secrecy. The company was clearly taking the discovery very seriously. In the game itself, when players explore the Ben-Aura underground area, they can see the weapon. In the depths of Judgment area, in the northern sections of the first underground zone, the weapon's massive shoulders are visible, emerging from crystal formations. The camera angle and level design don't allow players to see the full creature, but the visible portions match the distinctive profile of Emerald Weapon, with its characteristic ridges and the 4 orbs that would normally float around it. Interestingly, the Crisis Core Complete Guide specifically notes that while this weapon resembles Emerald Weapon, it is actually a different weapon that has never been seen in its active state. This distinction is important. Shinra didn't discover Emerald Weapon specifically, but rather another member of the same class of planetary guardians. This suggests that the planet created more weapons than just the 5 or 6 we encounter in the games, and that some remained in stasis in locations other than the northern crater. The presence of this weapon beneath Benora raises fascinating questions about the geography and geology of weapons distribution. Were multiple weapons stationed at different locations around the world as a distributed defense network? Or did this particular weapon migrate through underground Mako flows to end up far from the northern crater? The fact that it's surrounded by crystallized Mako suggests it was preserved by the same process that kept the northern crater weapons dormant, which means its presence in the Medill area might have been intentional positioning by the planet. The rich Mako concentration in the Benora region makes sense from this perspective. Weapons are essentially beings made from condensed lifestream, and their preservation requires abundant spiritual energy. The fact that Benora's soil was so fertile, rich enough to produce the unique Benora white apples found nowhere else, also indicates strong lifestream presence near the surface. The weapon beneath Benora would have been like a node in the planet's defense grid, stationed where spiritual energy was concentrated. But let's return to the key question. What did Shinra know? The fact that they found a weapon, that they recognized it as significant enough to warrant shutting down mining operations and building an entire cover village, strongly suggests they understood what they had discovered. This wasn't just an unusual geological formation or an oversized monster. The response indicates they knew this was something categorically different and important. However, there's a crucial caveat embedded in the official description of the discovery. The Crisis Core Complete Guide's explanation of Benora's history includes a telling detail. At the time of the discovery, Shinra could not determine what the weapon was. They knew they had found something extraordinary, something that didn't fit conventional categories, but the company apparently couldn't identify it as a weapon. Or if they suspected what it might be, they couldn't confirm it. This makes sense when we consider the timeline. The Benora mining operation and subsequent village construction would have occurred before Genesis was born, since Genesis grew up in Benora as a seemingly normal child in what he believed was his ancestral home. Genesis was born around the same time as Sephiroth, approximately 30 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII. This means the Benora discovery happened at least 3 decades before the game, possibly earlier. At that point in history, Professor Gast was still working for Shinra. He was the head of the science department and would have been consulted about any unusual discoveries made during resource extraction operations. Gast's research into the Cetra had probably begun. He may have even started preliminary work on what would become the Genova project, but his knowledge of ancient lore might not have been comprehensive enough yet to definitively identify the Benora discovery as a weapon. Moreover, the weapon was dormant, locked in crystal, showing no signs of life, without clear identifying markers, without being able to study its internal structure or see it in action. Positive identification would have been difficult. If Gast had encountered references to weapons in his Cetra research, those ancient texts would have described the weapon's purpose and power, but physical descriptions might have been limited or metaphorical. Matching fragmentary textual descriptions to an enormous crystallized form buried underground would be challenging. The company's response suggests they at least suspected they had found something related to ancient legends. The decision to seal off the area and monitor it indicates they thought it might be dangerous if disturbed, or might be valuable for future research, or both. Building a village specifically to hide the discovery shows they didn't want other organizations, possibly including the nation of Wutai, Shinra's primary rival at the time. Learning about the find, staffing Benora with Shinra employees disguised as villagers created a permanent observation post. These embedded personnel could monitor the sealed caverns for any changes in the weapon status, could prevent unauthorized access, and could maintain the fiction that Benora was just another rural community. This level of operational security is consistent with how Shinra handled other sensitive discoveries and projects. The fact that Genesis and Angeal grew up in Benora, unaware of what lay beneath their hometown, shows how effective this cover was. Genesis was the product of Project G, one of the Genova Project's experimental branches, yet he apparently never learned about the weapon discovery until much later, if at all. Dr. Hollander, who oversaw Project G and would have had high security clearance, might have known, but Genesis himself, despite being a product of Shinra's most secret genetic research program, remained ignorant. This compartmentalization of information is crucial to understanding how Shinra operated. The company didn't simply have secrets, it had layered systems of classified information where knowledge was distributed on a strict need-to-know basis. Someone working on the Genova project might not be cleared to know about the Ben-Aura weapon. Someone monitoring the Ben-Aura site might not be cleared to know about soldier enhancement procedures. Even high-ranking executives didn't necessarily have access to all of Shinra's classified projects and discoveries. When Professor Gast eventually left Shinra in disgust after learning that Genova was not a Cetra, but an alien threat, he took his knowledge with him. His departure would have created a knowledge gap in the science department. Hojo inherited Gast's position and presumably gained access to his research files, but whether those files included detailed information about the Ben-Aura discovery is unclear. Hojo's primary focus was always on the Genova project and creating super soldiers. Environmental discoveries and ancient guardian creatures might not have interested him unless they had direct applications to his work. There's also the question of what happened to the Ben-Aura weapon between its discovery and the events of Crisis Core. The cavern containing the weapon was sealed, but clearly not destroyed or removed. When Zack Fair explores the Ben-Aura underground years later, the weapon is still there, still preserved in crystal, apparently unchanged. Did Shinra ever attempt to study it in detail? Did they try to collect samples to analyze its composition to understand how it was created? Given Shinra's typical approach to unusual discoveries, they probably did attempt some level of research. However, the risks of disturbing a dormant weapon would have been apparent. Ancient texts warned that the weapons were created to reduce everything to nothingness when threats arose. Provoking such a creature into waking up, especially when it was stationed in an area with civilian presence above ground, would have been incredibly dangerous. Cautious observation without direct interference was probably the safest approach. The knowledge that at least one weapon definitely existed, preserved in crystallized Marco in a dormant state, should have fundamentally altered how Shinra viewed the ancient texts. Finding physical proof that the weapons were real, not mythological, should have prompted serious re-evaluation of what those Cetra documents were actually describing. If one part of the ancient legends turned out to be literally true, what about the rest? This physical confirmation of weapons' existence should have led to several important conclusions. First, that the planet did indeed have the capability to create massive defensive organisms. Second, that these weapons were preserved in stasis, suggesting they might awaken under certain conditions. Third, that Shinra's operations, particularly Mako extraction, might potentially provoke a response from these planetary guardians. But here's where things get complicated, and where the mystery of what Shinra actually knew deepens. Despite having found proof that weapons existed, despite having a specimen preserved beneath one of their cover villages, Shinra's actual behavior doesn't reflect an organization that took this threat seriously. They continued expanding Mako extraction operations, continued pushing their exploitation of the planet's spiritual energy, continued pursuing projects that would inevitably strain the planet's capacity to tolerate their presence. Either Shinra's leadership didn't believe the dormant weapon represented a serious threat, or the information about the Ben-Aura discovery never reached the right people, or the implications weren't properly understood by those who did know. To understand which of these possibilities is most likely, we need to examine what specific individuals within Shinra knew and how they responded to that knowledge, starting with the company's head scientist, Hojo's knowledge versus his claims, the Northern Crater contradiction. When the party reaches the Northern Crater in Final Fantasy VII, traveling through the whirlwind maze towards Sephiroth's location, they're accompanied by an unlikely group, President Rufus Shinra, Professor Hojo, and the executives Scarlet and Heidegger. This journey into the heart of the planet's wand represents a crucial moment for revealing what Shinra's leadership knew, or thought they knew, about the weapons and the impending crisis. It's in this setting, surrounded by the massive Mako cocoons that have preserved the weapons for 2 millennia, that Professor Hojo makes his famous statement. Looking at the enormous forms beginning to stir within their crystal prisons, he says something that has puzzled fans ever since. Weapon. Then it really does exist. I didn't believe in it. This statement appears to be a clear admission that Hojo previously thought the weapons were mythological. The phrasing suggests genuine surprise and discovery, then it really does exist, implies he's encountering evidence that contradicts his prior beliefs. He follows this admission by citing Professor Gast's report, explaining that the weapons are monsters created by the planet that appear when the planet is in danger, reducing everything to nothingness. The fact that Hojo can quote Gast's report indicates he had access to this information. After Gast's departure and subsequent death, Hojo inherited his predecessor's position as head of the science department, which would have included access to Gast's research files. Hojo knew that ancient sources described the weapons. He knew what they were supposedly capable of. He had documentary evidence from a scientist he respected describing these planetary guardians. Yet despite having access to these reports, despite working for a company that had discovered a dormant weapon beneath Ben-Ora, Hojo claims he didn't believe the weapons were real. How do we reconcile this apparent contradiction? One possibility is that Hojo is lying or being deliberately misleading. Hojo is, after all, one of the most duplicitous characters in Final Fantasy VII. He routinely conceals information, misleads his colleagues, and pursues secret agendas. His entire approach to science is characterized by a lack of ethics and a willingness to deceive anyone, including his superiors, to achieve his research goals. Could he be pretending ignorance about the weapons for some strategic reason? If Hojo were lying, what would be his motive? One possibility is that he wanted to gauge Rufus Shinra's reaction to the weapons. By pretending surprise and disbelief, he could observe whether the new president already knew about the weapons, whether other executives had been briefed, and how the company's leadership might respond to this threat. Hojo always operated with multiple layers of deception, gathering information while pretending ignorance. However, this explanation doesn't quite fit the context. Hojo's tone when speaking about the weapons doesn't sound calculating or strategic. It sounds genuinely surprised. Moreover, he immediately shifts into explanation mode, describing what the weapons are based on Gast's reports. If his goal were deception, the smarter play would be to remain silent and let others reveal their knowledge first. Instead, Hojo volunteers information, suggesting he's being sincere. Another possibility is that Hojo knew about the weapons intellectually. He'd read the reports, understood the ancient legends, was aware of the Ben-Ora discovery, but didn't actually believe they represented a real threat. There's a significant difference between knowing that something exists in theory and believing it will ever become practically relevant. Consider Hojo's mindset and priorities. His entire career focused on genetic engineering, creating super soldiers, producing specimens with enhanced capabilities through Genova cell integration. His worldview was laboratory-centric, focused on what could be created and controlled through scientific manipulation. The idea that the planet itself might have autonomous defensive capabilities that could surpass anything Shinra could create wouldn't fit comfortably in his conceptual framework. Hojo might have reviewed the Ben-Ora discovery reports, acknowledged that yes, there was a large crystallized organism underground that matched ancient descriptions of weapons, but dismissed the notion that such creatures could ever wake up or pose a serious threat. From his perspective, the weapon beneath Ben-Ora had been dormant for thousands of years. Why would it suddenly awaken? What mechanism could even trigger such awakening? This kind of dismissive attitude toward long-dormant threats is psychologically very common. People regularly discount risks that seem abstract or distant, even when they have concrete evidence those risks exist. Hojo might have filed the weapons under theoretically possible but practically irrelevant dangers, the kind of thing you note in reports but don't actually prepare for, because the likelihood of it ever mattering seems infinitesimal. There's also the question of information quality and reliability. Hojo's statement at the northern crater comes after he's seen the weapons with his own eyes, witnessed them beginning to awaken, observed them in full context. Seeing them in this state, massive, clearly biological, obviously capable of movement and action, is different from reading reports about a dormant specimen buried under Ben-Ora or studying fragmentary ancient texts. The Ben-Ora weapon was encased in crystal, inert, showing no vital signs. It could have been a fossil, a mineral formation that coincidentally resembled legendary descriptions, or an ancient organism that died millennia ago and was naturally preserved. Without being able to study it actively, without seeing biological functions or signs of consciousness, skepticism about whether it could ever awaken would be reasonable. When Hojo says he didn't believe in it, he might specifically mean he didn't believe the weapons could wake up and act as planetary defenders. He might have acknowledged their existence as geological or biological curiosities, while dismissing the functional aspects, the idea that they could awaken, move, attack, reduce everything to nothingness, as the ancient texts claimed. Believing in their physical existence is different from believing in their mythological purpose and power. This interpretation is supported by how Hojo behaves after seeing the awakening weapons. He doesn't panic or show fear. Instead, he seems fascinated, immediately moving into analytical mode, explaining what they are and citing his sources. For Hojo, the awakening weapons are primarily interesting data points, confirmation that the ancient legends were more accurate than he'd given them credit for. Even facing planetary defense mechanisms that could destroy civilization, his response is scientific curiosity rather than existential dread. There's another layer to consider. What Hojo could reasonably have known about the connection between the weapons awakening and specific triggers. The ancient texts said the weapons appear when the planet is in danger. But what constitutes sufficient danger to wake them? Shinra had been draining Mako for decades. They'd built massive reactors across the world. They'd conducted genetic experiments with an alien organism. Yet throughout all of this, no weapons had awakened. From Hojo's perspective, if the weapons were supposed to respond to threats against the planet, shouldn't they have woken up already? Shinra's Mako extraction was demonstrably harming the planet. Even Bugenhagen and the planetologists at Cosmo Canyon could measure the damage to the lifestream. Yet the weapons remained dormant. This absence of response might have reinforced Hojo's skepticism that they could wake up at all. What Hojo couldn't have anticipated was that the weapons required a very specific level of threat to trigger their awakening. They weren't designed to respond to gradual harm or incremental damage. They were created to counter existential, apocalyptic threats. Things like Genova's arrival that could potentially destroy the planet entirely. Shinra's Mako exploitation, while harmful, wasn't severe enough to be perceived as that kind of ultimate threat. Only when Sephiroth summons Meteor, the ultimate destructive magic capable of creating a wound so severe the planet might never recover, do the weapons finally wake. This is exactly the scenario they were designed for. An impact, comparable to Genova's original meteorite strike. A threat that could end all life on Gaia. The summoning of Meteor crosses the threshold that decades of Mako extraction never reached. Hojo witnesses this awakening and realizes that the ancient texts were accurate in ways he hadn't appreciated. The weapons do exist. They can wake up. They will respond to sufficient threats. All the things he'd filed under interesting mythology turn out to be literal operational protocols for planetary defense. His surprise at the northern crater reflects this paradigm shift. The moment when academic knowledge becomes immediate, visceral reality. The question remains, why wasn't Hojo better informed? If Shinra had discovered a weapon beneath Benora decades earlier, if that discovery triggered enough concern to warrant building a cover village, why wasn't their head scientist made aware of the implications? This brings us to one of Shinra's most significant structural problems. How the company managed information. Corporate secrecy and information. Compartmentalization. Who knew what? One of the most important things to understand about the Shinra Electric Power Company is that it wasn't a monolithic organization where everyone shared the same information. Shinra was an enormous corporation with multiple divisions, secret projects, and competing internal factions. Knowledge was power within Shinra, and information was carefully controlled, distributed on a strictly need-to-know basis. This compartmentalization explains many of the apparent contradictions in what different Shinra personnel knew about the weapons. It's entirely possible for the corporation as an entity to have discovered the Benora weapon, documented it and maintained observation of it, while simultaneously having key personnel like Hojo remain genuinely unaware of the discovery's full implications. Consider the structure of Shinra's operations. The company had distinct divisions: research and development under Hojo, urban development under Reeve, space and aeronautics under the hapless Parma, public security under Heidegger, and advanced weaponry under Scarlet. Each division operated with significant autonomy, pursuing its own projects and protecting its own secrets. Cross-departmental communication was limited and there was constant competition for resources and presidential favor. When the Ben-Hora weapon was discovered, it would have been during mining operations assessing potential Mako reactor sites. This falls under the jurisdiction of urban development and public security rather than research and development. The initial reports would have gone to executives overseeing infrastructure expansion, not to scientists studying the Cetra. Hojo's department would have had no obvious reason to be informed about a geological discovery in a rural area earmarked for possible Mako extraction. President Shinra, the original president, Rufus' father, would have been briefed on the Ben-Hora discovery. Any find significant enough to warrant building an entire cover village would require presidential approval for the resources involved. The old president would have made the decision about how to handle this discovery, who else needed to know, and what protocols to establish for monitoring it. The president's approach to the Ben-Hora weapon appears to have been cautious containment. Seal it off, observe it, don't disturb it, and keep the discovery secret. This makes strategic sense from his perspective. If the weapon matched ancient legends about planetary guardians, poking it or attempting aggressive study could be dangerous. Better to simply ensure it remained dormant and monitor for any changes. But this cautious approach meant the discovery's significance wasn't widely disseminated within the company. If the official position was, "We found something unusual, we're keeping it sealed and watching it," then most departments would never be informed at all. The weapon became a classified matter, handled by specific personnel on a need-to-know basis, like many other Shinra secrets. Professor Gast, if he was still with the company when the Ben-Hora discovery occurred, might have been consulted. His expertise in Cetra history would have made him the logical person to ask about whether the find matched anything in ancient texts. But even if Gast identified it as a weapon, his report would have been just one document among many in Shinra's files. Another piece of information about ancient organisms, filed alongside all the other Cetra research. When Gast left Shinra, disgusted by the truth about Genova, he took with him not just his physical presence, but also his institutional knowledge. The connections he might have drawn between various pieces of Cetra lore, the expertise that could have warned about the weapon's significance, departed with him. Hojo inherited Gast's position and files, but inheriting someone's paperwork isn't the same as inheriting their understanding. Hojo would have had access to reports mentioning the weapons, including Gast's documentation of Cetra texts describing them. But these would have been among hundreds or thousands of other documents about ancient civilization, mythology, and history. Unless someone specifically briefed Hojo on, "This is critically important, the weapons are real, we found one." The information about weapons would just be part of the general archive of Cetra research. Moreover, Hojo's interests lay elsewhere. He was obsessed with the Genova project, with creating super soldiers, with genetic manipulation and enhancement. Reading through dry reports about ancient mythology probably seemed like a waste of time compared to his active experiments. If someone had said, "Professor Gast documented some old stories about planetary defenders," Hojo might have skimmed the report and forgotten about it immediately, focused on more immediate concerns. This explains how Hojo could have theoretical access to information about the weapons while remaining functionally ignorant of their importance. The knowledge existed in Shinra's systems, but it wasn't actively brought to his attention, and he had no motivation to dig through archived Cetra research looking for it. The Ben-Hora discovery might not even be mentioned in the files he inherited from Gast. It could be classified separately, accessible only to certain divisions or security levels. Rufus Shinra, when he becomes president after his father's death, demonstrates similar gaps in knowledge. At the northern crater, when Hojo explains what the weapons are by citing Gast's report, Rufus responds, "I never saw that report." Where is it? This is a remarkable admission. The new president of the company, supposedly one of the most powerful and informed individuals in the organization, never encountered this crucial piece of research. Hojo's response is telling. He simply points at his own head, indicating that the knowledge exists in his memory rather than in any accessible filing system. This suggests Gast's reports about the weapons weren't standard documentation available in Shinra's general archives. Perhaps they were destroyed when Gast left, or classified at a level even Rufus couldn't access, or simply lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of decades of research. The fact that Rufus never saw these reports despite his position is significant. Rufus was groomed to take over the company. He would have been briefed on major issues, given access to important classified information, prepared for leadership. Yet the knowledge of what the weapons were, gleaned from Cetra sources and documented by Shinra's former head scientist, somehow never reached him. This could be intentional on his father's part. The old president was notorious for keeping secrets, for maintaining control through information manipulation. He might have deliberately kept certain classified matters from Rufus, not trusting his son with sensitive information. Or perhaps he died before completing Rufus's transition briefings, leaving crucial knowledge unshared when Sephiroth killed him. It's also possible that the information about weapons was buried in classified reports that technically existed, but that no one bothered to read. Large organizations regularly lose track of their own institutional knowledge. Important documents get misfiled, classified at the wrong security level, or simply forgotten because the people who understood their significance retire or leave. Shinra, despite its technological sophistication, wasn't immune to basic bureaucratic dysfunction. The compartmentalization extended to other divisions as well. Scarlet, head of advanced weaponry, focused on military technology, developing bigger guns, better armor, more destructive ordnance. Ancient legends about planetary guardians wouldn't seem relevant to her division. Unless someone explicitly said, there might be massive creatures that could attack our installations, she had no reason to dig into Cetra research. Heidegger, commanding public security, worried about threats from Avalanche, maintaining control over occupied territories, suppressing dissent. Again, ancient mythology about weapons would seem irrelevant to his concerns. The idea that the planet itself might generate defensive organisms to attack Shinra facilities would sound absurd, not the kind of actionable intelligence you build security protocols around. Reeve, head of urban development, might actually have been one of the better-informed executives. His division's involvement in reactor construction and resource surveys would have given him access to reports about unusual discoveries during excavation operations. The Benora finding would have crossed his desk or his division's files. However, Reeve's later actions suggest he either wasn't fully briefed on the implications or chose to remain focused on his own secret activities. The Turks, Shinra's intelligence division, certainly knew about the Benora weapon. They would have been involved in setting up the cover village, in staffing it with disguised personnel, in maintaining operational security, but the Turks operated under their own classification system, reporting directly to the president. Information they gathered didn't necessarily flow to other departments. Zhang, Reno, Rodii. They knew Shinra's secrets, but they kept those secrets as part of their job. This fractured information landscape meant that when the weapons actually awakened, Shinra's response was uncoordinated and reactive. There was no pre-existing plan for dealing with weapons, because most of the company's leadership didn't know they existed. The knowledge was there, scattered across different files, held by different individuals, but never synthesized into a coherent understanding that could inform strategic planning. When Sapphire Weapon emerged from the ocean and began its assault on Junon, Shinra responded with whatever force they had available. Conventional military, the sister Ryamako cannon, their standard defensive protocols. They treated the weapon as just an unusually large and powerful monster, something that could be fought with sufficient firepower. The deeper implications, that this was the planet itself retaliating, that more weapons would follow, that they represented consequences for decades of environmental exploitation, weren't grasped until too late. President Rufus, trying to understand what they were facing, had to get his information from Hojo in the middle of a crisis. No one had briefed him beforehand. No one had said, "Mr. President, if we continue depleting the planet's lifestream, we might face retaliation from ancient guardians." The institutional knowledge that could have warned them was either lost, ignored, or never properly connected to operational planning. This failure of information management ultimately doomed Shinra's ability to respond effectively to the weapons. By the time they understood what they were facing, Diamond Weapon was already marching on Midgar. Rufus would be seemingly killed in its attack. The company's command structure would collapse. All because crucial knowledge about the weapons existed within the organization, but never reached the people who needed it most. Understanding this compartmentalization is crucial to answering our central question. Did Shinra know about the weapons before Meteor? The answer is yes, but in a fragmented, incomplete way that prevented the company from acting on that knowledge. The information existed, but it was scattered, classified, and never synthesized into actionable intelligence. Bugenhagen's perspective, when even experts dismiss the truth. While Shinra's ignorance about the weapons can be partially explained by corporate dysfunction and information compartmentalization, there's another crucial piece of evidence we need to examine. The perspective of people outside Shinra who should theoretically have known better. Specifically, we need to look at Bugenhagen, the wise elder of Cosmo Canyon and one of the world's foremost authorities on planetology. Bugenhagen is a fascinating figure in Final Fantasy VII's world. He's not affiliated with Shinra. In fact, he actively opposes their exploitation of the planet. He's dedicated his long life to studying the planet's mechanisms, understanding the lifestream, and preserving ancient knowledge. His observatory in Cosmo Canyon houses extensive research materials, some provided by Professor Gast himself before his death. If anyone outside Shinra should have known about the weapons, it's Bugenhagen. Yet according to the lore, even Bugenhagen believed the weapons were mythological rather than real. The game describes how many planetologists, Bugenhagen included, considered the weapons to be just a myth and an allegory. This is remarkable. Here's a man who can sense the planet's spiritual energy, who has studied Cetra texts and artifacts, who has access to extensive research materials, and even he didn't believe the weapons literally existed as physical creatures. What does Bugenhagen's skepticism tell us? It suggests that the evidence for the weapon's existence, even to someone sympathetically disposed toward ancient wisdom, was insufficient to establish certainty. The fragmentary Cetra texts, the legendary accounts, the mythological references, all of this could be interpreted as symbolic or metaphorical rather than literal descriptions of actual organisms. Bugenhagen's academic approach to studying the planet combined respect for ancient knowledge with scientific rigor. He believed in the lifestream's reality, understood the planet as a living entity, and took Cetra wisdom seriously. But he also applied critical thinking to evaluate claims. When ancient texts spoke of massive creatures that could reduce everything to nothingness, Bugenhagen apparently interpreted this as allegorical. Language describing the planet's power to reshape itself through geological and spiritual forces rather than literal descriptions of biological weapons. This interpretation makes sense from a planetological perspective. The planet does have enormous destructive capabilities through natural means. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, climate shifts, geological upheavals. The lifestream itself, if weaponized, could conceivably manifest in catastrophic ways. Perhaps ancient peoples, witnessing these planetary forces in action, personified them as monsters, giving them names and characteristics as a way of understanding natural phenomena. From this viewpoint, the weapons would be the Cetra's mythological representation of the planet's intrinsic ability to defend itself through natural disasters and spiritual energy manipulation. Bugenhagen might have thought, the weapons are real in the sense that the planet's defensive capabilities are real, but they're not real as distinct biological entities. It's a sophisticated academic position, acknowledging the truth contained in myth while distinguishing between literal and symbolic meanings. The fact that someone as knowledgeable as Bugenhagen held this position is crucial for understanding why Shinra personnel might have dismissed the weapons. If even an expert sympathetic to ancient wisdom thought the weapons were allegorical, how could we expect Shinra's scientists, coming from a more materialistic and reductionist worldview, to believe otherwise? Bugenhagen's skepticism provided intellectual cover for Shinra's dismissal. Moreover, Bugenhagen had never encountered any physical evidence of the weapons. He didn't know about the Benora discovery. That information was classified by Shinra and never made public. Without physical proof, without being able to study an actual specimen, his conclusion that the weapons were mythological was the most reasonable interpretation of the available evidence. When Bugenhagen does finally learn about the weapons, when they awaken and begin attacking Shinra's installations, his response is notable. There's no sense of, I was wrong and should have known better, but rather an attitude of, the ancient texts were more literally accurate than we realized. He adapts his understanding quickly, accepting the new evidence without excessive skepticism or denial. This intellectual flexibility distinguishes Bugenhagen from many of Shinra's personnel. When confronted with evidence that contradicts their assumptions, Bujin Hagen integrates it into his worldview. Hojo, by contrast, seems more fascinated by being proven wrong than troubled by it. Other Shinra executives never really grasp the implications of the weapons, even after seeing them, continuing to treat them as military problems that can be solved with sufficient firepower. Bujin Hagen's relationship with Professor Gast is also significant here. According to dialogue from Kate Sith and other sources, Bujin Hagen formerly worked for Shinra in some capacity, though he never developed weapons or dealt with Mako exploitation. He left the company to pursue planetology independently, establishing himself at Cosmo Canyon. Gast, as a friend, provided Bujin Hagen with research materials and scientific equipment, helping establish the observatory. This connection means Bujin Hagen would have had access to at least some of Gast's research, possibly including early work on Cetra civilization. If Gast's reports mentioned the weapons, Bujin Hagen would have seen these references. Yet even with this inside access to Shinra's top scientists' work, Bujin Hagen still concluded the weapons were mythological. This suggests Gast himself wasn't certain about the weapons' literal existence. Or if he was, he didn't emphasize this in the materials he shared. The relationship between Gast and Bujin Hagen represents a fascinating parallel to Shinra's own internal dynamics. Two intelligent, educated people studying the same ancient texts and reaching similar conclusions, the weapons were probably allegorical. This wasn't the result of corporate deception or willful ignorance, it was the most reasonable interpretation given the evidence available. What changed this interpretation was direct experience. When the weapons actually appeared, when they began attacking Shinra facilities, when they demonstrated exactly the catastrophic power that ancient texts had described, everyone had to rapidly revise their understanding. Mythology became history, allegory became literal truth, the impossible became immediate reality. Bujin Hagen's initial skepticism, followed by rapid acceptance, mirrors a journey that many characters in Final Fantasy VII undergo. They start by thinking they understand how the world works, by believing their modern scientific worldview has surpassed ancient superstitions, and then reality forces them to confront how limited their understanding actually was. The planet is genuinely alive. The Cetra's warnings were accurate, the old stories contained essential truths. This theme, the hubris of modernity and the wisdom of ancient knowledge, runs throughout Final Fantasy VII's narrative. Shinra represents the apex of this hubris, a corporation so confident in its technological mastery that it literally drains the planet's life force for profit, dismissing warnings and concerns as primitive environmentalism. The awakening of the weapons is, in many ways, the planet's response to this arrogance. But it's important to note that this wasn't a simple story of enlightened ancients versus ignorant moderns. Even the Cetra themselves in their time probably didn't fully understand the weapons they were creating. The planet acted autonomously to generate these defenders, the Cetra didn't build them or design them. Ancient texts describing the weapons would have been written by people trying to understand phenomena beyond their complete comprehension. So when modern researchers like Gast, B/U00 Fchinhagen or even Hojo encountered these ancient descriptions, they were reading accounts written by people who themselves were struggling to explain what they'd witnessed. Multiple layers of interpretation, Cetra trying to describe the weapons, modern researchers trying to interpret Cetra descriptions, created ample room for misunderstanding and skepticism. The surprising thing, in retrospect, is not that people dismissed the weapons as myth, but that the ancient texts were accurate enough that researchers could identify what the weapons were once they actually appeared. When Hojo sees the awakening weapons in the northern crater, he immediately recognizes them from Gast's reports, citing the descriptions accurately. The ancient knowledge had been preserved well enough to be recognizable, it just hadn't been believed. This brings us to new evidence from the most recent entry in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. While the original game and Crisis Core provide our primary sources, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth adds fascinating new dimensions to the question of what Shinra knew about the weapons, and when they knew it. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, new evidence of Shinra's active interest. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the second game in the remake trilogy, introduces several significant additions to the lore surrounding the weapons. These additions don't contradict the established timeline, but rather fill in gaps, providing new context for understanding Shinra's relationship with these planetary guardians. Perhaps most significantly, Rebirth reveals that Shinra didn't just passively observe the dormant weapon beneath Benora, they actively pursued weapons in the present day. The game introduces the Magnus Materia Project, a Shinra initiative specifically focused on acquiring cores from weapons. This is a major revelation. It indicates that by the time of Rebirth's events, Shinra not only knew weapons existed, but had developed specific protocols for targeting them, understanding their structure well enough to know they possessed cores, and competing with other nations to secure these valuable components. According to Rebirth's lore, some weapons have started becoming active, and Shinra is racing against Wutai to capture them before their rivals can. This competition implies several things. First, knowledge of the weapon's existence has somehow become less secret. Both Shinra and Wutai know about them, and consider them valuable enough to pursue. Second, these particular weapons are in a semi-active state, neither fully dormant like the Benora weapon, nor fully awakened like those that emerge after Meteor's summoning. The game shows two massive weapon-like creatures emerging from Magnus Materia inside Mako reactors at Coral and Gonaga. These are described in supplementary materials as being in their larval stage, suggesting they might eventually mature into the more recognizable weapon forms we know. They appear as huge whale-like creatures with large fins and materia embedded in their chests, serving as cores. This is fascinating from a biological and metaphysical perspective. These larval weapons suggest that the planet's defensive mechanisms aren't static. They can spawn new guardians, or existing weapons can go through developmental stages. The fact that they appear inside Mako reactors is particularly significant. Reactors concentrate lifestream energy, creating artificial nodes of spiritual energy concentration. The planet might be spawning these new weapons specifically at sites where its lifestream is being most aggressively exploited. The timing of these weapons' emergence is also crucial. According to the Ultimania Guide for Rebirth, these weapons are created as a response to Sephiroth attempting to defy fate. This connects them to Rebirth's larger themes about destiny, timeline alteration, and resistance to predetermined outcomes. The weapons aren't just responding to Mako exploitation, they're responding to metaphysical disturbances in the timeline itself. Shinra's knowledge of these larval weapons, and their pursuit of Magnus Materia, indicates a significant shift from the company's previous stance. Rather than cautiously observing a single dormant specimen beneath Benora, they're now actively hunting weapons, developing technology to extract their cores, and treating them as resources to be exploited. This represents an escalation in both knowledge and aggression. The Magnus Materia project implies Shinra has learned several key things about weapons. They contain powerful materia as part of their core structure. These cores can be extracted, and doing so is valuable enough to warrant dangerous field operations. This knowledge had to come from somewhere, perhaps from studies of the Benora weapon, perhaps from recovered Cetra texts that described weapon anatomy, or perhaps from preliminary encounters with the larval weapons themselves. What's particularly intriguing is that Wutai is also pursuing weapons. This suggests information about the weapons has leaked beyond Shinra's control, or that Wutai has conducted their own research into ancient legends and reached similar conclusions about the weapon's value. The competition between these rival nations over weapon cores adds a geopolitical dimension to the story that wasn't present in the original game. From Shinra's perspective, Magnus Materia from weapons would represent the ultimate achievement in their exploitation of planetary resources. If weapons are the planet's ultimate expressions of concentrated lifestream energy, their cores would be exponentially more powerful than regular materia. Possessing such cores could give Shinra unprecedented military and economic advantages. The fact that they're willing to deploy significant resources to compete with Wutai for these cores indicates how highly they value them. This active pursuit of weapons in Rebirth creates an interesting timeline question. If Shinra is hunting weapons during the events of Rebirth, which takes place before the summoning of Meteor, then they definitely know weapons exist and are active. Yet when we reach the northern crater in the original game's timeline, after Meteor has been summoned, Hojo acts surprised by the weapon's awakening. How do we reconcile this? One possibility is that the Magnus Materia project operates independently from the main science division. Perhaps it's a classified military initiative run by Scarlet's Advanced Weaponry Division, with Hojo not being directly involved or informed. This would fit with Shinra's compartmentalized structure, different divisions pursuing different projects without full knowledge of each other's activities. Another possibility is that the larval weapons in Rebirth are different from the ancient weapons preserved in the northern crater. Shinra might understand that the planet is spawning new defensive organisms at Mako reactor sites, while still not believing that the legendary weapons from 2,000 years ago could actually wake up. In this interpretation, they're dealing with what they perceive as new phenomena while remaining ignorant of the far more powerful ancient weapons waiting in the crater. The involvement of white whispers alongside these larval weapons also suggests something complex is happening with the planet's defenses. The whispers, introduced in Final Fantasy VII Remake as arbiters of fate and destiny, work to maintain the proper timeline. The fact that some whispers are white, associated with the planet's will, and work in tandem with weapons suggests a coordinated defensive response against both temporal and physical threats. Rebirth also introduces the concept that Sephiroth can control certain whispers, turning them to his purposes. If the planet spawns weapons partially in response to Sephiroth's timeline manipulation, this creates a three-way conflict. Sephiroth trying to alter fate, the planet trying to defend itself and preserve proper temporal flow, and Shinra trying to exploit whatever resources emerge from this conflict without fully understanding the larger picture. From Shinra's perspective, they're encountering powerful new creatures and attempting to harvest valuable material from them. They probably don't grasp the full metaphysical significance of what's happening, that these weapons represent the planet's response to timeline corruption, that the cores they're pursuing are components of planetary defensive systems designed to counter threats they can barely comprehend. This is consistent with how Shinra operates throughout the compilation. They're constantly dealing with phenomena beyond their understanding, applying reductionist technological solutions to metaphysical problems. They found Genova and tried to weaponize her without understanding she was an alien intelligence. They discovered Mako and built an entire civilization around it without grasping they were, literally draining the planet's life force. Now they're hunting weapons and extracting their cores without realizing these are the planet's ultimate defense mechanisms. The Magnus Materia project also raises questions about what happened to the Benora weapon. If Shinra developed the capability to extract cores from weapons, did they ever attempt to do so with their original discovery? Or does the Benora weapon remain sealed in its cavern, too dangerous to approach, too valuable as a research site to disturb? The game doesn't provide explicit answers, but the logical progression would suggest they at least considered attempting core extraction. The competition with Wutai adds another layer of urgency to Shinra's pursuit of weapons. If their geopolitical rivals are also after Magnus Materia, Shinra can't afford to be cautious. They need to move quickly, take risks, secure cores before Wutai does. This time pressure could explain increasingly aggressive tactics, which in turn could contribute to provoking stronger responses from the planet's defensive systems. What's clear from Rebirth is that Shinra's relationship with the weapons evolved significantly between the Benora discovery and the present day. They moved from cautious observation of a dormant specimen to active pursuit of semi-awakened creatures, from academic uncertainty about whether weapons existed to operational planning for extracting their cores. This represents a significant escalation in both knowledge and ambition. Yet this evolution was apparently siloed within specific divisions. Hojo's surprise at the northern crater suggests the Magnus Materia project operated independently from the science division's research agenda. Rufus's ignorance of Gast's reports indicates the corporate leadership wasn't fully briefed on all weapon-related activities. Even as Shinra became more actively engaged with weapons in some departments, comprehensive understanding remained elusive. The evidence from Rebirth complicates our attempt to answer the central question. Did Shinra know about the weapons before Meteor? The answer is clearly yes. They knew about them, pursued them, developed specific protocols for dealing with them. But this knowledge was fragmented, compartmentalized, and incomplete. Different parts of the organization knew different things, and crucial connections between ancient legends, the Benora discovery, and the emerging larval weapons were never fully made. The grand conspiracy theory, assembling a complete timeline. Now that we've examined all the evidence, the ancient Cetra texts, Professor Gast's research, the Benora discovery, Hojo's statements at the northern crater, Shinra's information compartmentalization, Bugenhagen's academic skepticism, and the new information from Rebirth, we can attempt to construct a comprehensive timeline of what Shinra knew about the weapons and when they learned it. The story begins approximately 30 years before Final Fantasy VII's main events. Shinra Electric Power Company, having perfected Mako extraction technology and risen to dominance as the world's primary energy provider, is aggressively expanding its operations. One site under consideration is the Benora region, chosen for its apparent Mako potential. Mining operations begin, digging deep underground to assess the area's resource viability. During these excavations, miners break through into a vast cavern system. There, preserved in massive crystal formations of hardened Mako, they discover something extraordinary, an enormous creature unlike anything in modern biology, matching descriptions from fragmentary ancient texts about planetary guardians. Shinra has found a weapon. The discovery triggers immediate protocols. Mining operations cease, reports flow upward through the corporate hierarchy. President Shinra is briefed. He consults with his science division, where Professor Gast is still serving as department head. Gast reviews the findings, compares them to his research on Cetra civilization, and tentatively identifies the creature as a weapon, one of the legendary guardians described in ancient texts. But Gast's identification comes with uncertainty. The weapon is completely dormant, showing no signs of life. Ancient descriptions speak of creatures that reduce everything to nothingness, but the specimen beneath Benora is inert, locked in crystal, indistinguishable from a very unusual fossil. Gast can say, this matches the descriptions from Cetra sources, but cannot definitively prove it's a functional, living organism capable of the apocalyptic feats attributed to weapons in legend. President Shinra makes a calculated decision. The discovery is potentially significant, but also potentially dangerous. Attempting to excavate or study the creature aggressively could be catastrophic if it somehow woke up. The safest approach is containment. Seal the caverns, maintain observation, but don't directly interfere. To hide the discovery from potential competitors like Wutai, Shinra builds Benora village above the site, staffing it with company personnel disguised as ordinary residents. This response reflects wisdom, but also creates problems. By treating the weapon as a classified geological curiosity rather than a critical threat requiring comprehensive study, Shinra ensures that knowledge of the discovery remains limited. The decision-makers are a small group. The president, select executives involved in infrastructure development, possibly Gast, and the operatives tasked with maintaining the Benora cover. Professor Gast documents what he's learned about weapons in his reports on Cetra civilization. These reports include Ifalna's testimony about the ancient crisis, the creation of weapons in response to Genova's arrival, and their preserved state waiting to respond to future threats. But Gast never sees the Benora specimen directly. He only reviews second-hand reports from the mining operation. His documentation treats weapons as part of historical record rather than immediate concern. When Gast leaves Shinra, disgusted after learning the truth about Genova, he takes much of his expertise with him. The nuanced understanding he had developed about Cetra history, the connections he had drawn between different ancient sources, his ability to distinguish between mythological embellishment and historical fact, all of this departs with him. What remains are his written reports, sterile documents that future researchers will read without the benefit of Gast's living interpretations. Hojo inherits Gast's position and gains access to his files. But Hojo has different priorities. His focus is genetic engineering, creating super soldiers, advancing the Genova project. Ancient history holds little interest for him unless it directly relates to his experiments. When he reviews Gast's extensive research on Cetra civilization, the sections about weapons register as interesting historical notes, but nothing requiring immediate attention. Moreover, Hojo may not be briefed on the Benora discovery at all. The information is classified, held by different divisions, managed on a need-to-know basis. As head of the science division, Hojo has access to research files, but operational discoveries from mining surveys might be filed separately, accessible only to urban development and public security personnel. He knows the legends about weapons from Gast's reports, but he doesn't know Shinra has found physical evidence of their existence. Meanwhile, the Benora cover continues successfully. Genesis and Angel grow up in the village, unaware of what lies beneath their hometown. The disguised Shinra operatives maintain their roles, watching for any changes in the sealed caverns, but seeing none. Years pass with the weapon remaining completely inert. The operational reports become routine. No change. Specimen remains dormant, continuing observation. This extended period of inactivity reinforces skepticism about the weapon's significance. Yes, there's a large crystallized organism underground, but it hasn't moved or shown any vital signs in decades. Perhaps it's not actually alive. Perhaps the ancient texts exaggerated its capabilities. Perhaps it's just a very unusual fossil that happens to look like legendary descriptions. The longer it remains dormant, the less threatening it seems. As Shinra's leadership changes, executives retire, new personnel are hired, organizational memory gradually fades. The context for the Ben-Aura discovery is partially lost. New leadership knows there's something being monitored under Ben-Aura, but may not fully understand the historical significance or potential danger. The operation continues on momentum, a classified project that everyone accepts without questioning too deeply. Professor Gast meets Afalna in Icicle Inn, learns the full truth about Genova and the Cetra, attempts to hide with his new family. Hojo tracks them down, kills Gast, captures Afalna and their daughter Aerith. Whatever additional knowledge Gast had gained from Afalna about the weapons, whatever insights he had developed about the planet's defensive mechanisms, dies with him. The videos he recorded with Afalna survive, but their contents aren't widely disseminated within Shinra. Rufus Shinra, the president's son, is being groomed for eventual leadership. But his father, suspicious and controlling, doesn't share all of the company's secrets with him. The Ben-Aura weapon, Gast's detailed reports on Cetra history, the implications of what ancient texts said about planetary defense, Rufus never receives comprehensive briefings on these matters. When he eventually becomes president after Sephiroth kills his father, he inherits authority, but not complete knowledge. The Nibelheim incident occurs. Sephiroth discovers the truth about his origins, goes mad, is apparently killed by Cloud, but actually survives to begin his long-term plan for godhood. During this time, he presumably spends years within the lifestream, absorbing the knowledge of ancients, learning things that no living person knows. His understanding of the weapons, their purpose, their potential, all of this becomes part of his comprehensive knowledge. As Sephiroth's plans advance towards summoning Meteor, something begins changing in the planet's behavior. The larval weapons start appearing at Mako reactor sites, new guardians being spawned in response to multiple threats. The planet senses Sephiroth's presence in the lifestream, recognizes the danger he represents, begins activating its defenses. But these defenses manifest gradually, in stages, rather than all at once. Shinra's intelligence network detects these emerging larval weapons. Perhaps they appear first at remote reactor sites, perhaps they're initially mistaken for unusual monsters. But eventually someone, likely in Scarlet's Advanced Weaponry Division, realizes these are specimens matching Cetra descriptions of weapons. More importantly, they realize these creatures contain incredibly powerful materia cores. The Magnus Materia project is launched. Shinra begins actively pursuing these larval weapons, developing techniques to extract their cores. Intelligence indicates Wutai is also aware of these creatures, and pursuing them, creating geopolitical competition. Resources are allocated, teams deployed, a new phase of weapon engagement begins, but this project operates in relative isolation from other divisions. Hojo's science division isn't directly involved. This is a field operation, a military initiative, handled by divisions focused on immediate tactical concerns, rather than fundamental research. The connection between these emerging creatures and the ancient weapons, described in Gast's old reports, isn't clearly made. They're treated as new phenomena, rather than extensions of ancient threats. When Sephiroth summons Meteor, the threshold is finally crossed. The planet perceives an existential threat comparable to Genova's original arrival. The weapons preserved in the northern crater, dormant for 2,000 years, receive the signal they were designed to respond to. Their awakening is immediate and catastrophic. This is when Hojo finally sees weapons in their full context. Not as dormant specimens or semi-active larval forms, but as fully operational planetary defense systems. The massive creatures emerging from Mako cocoons in the northern crater are orders of magnitude more powerful than anything Shinra has encountered. They are, quite literally, the stuff of legends made real. Hojo's surprise is genuine because, despite having access to Gast's reports, despite working for a company that discovered a dormant weapon decades ago, despite recent operations to harvest Magnus materia from larval weapons, he never fully believed the ancient legends were describing functional military-scale threats. The awakening in the northern crater forces, a paradigm shift. What he thought was mythology turns out to be literally true. Rufus's ignorance is even more complete. As the new president, focused on consolidating power after his father's death and dealing with immediate crises like Sephiroth's return, he never received comprehensive briefings about Shinra's historical discoveries or long-term classified projects. The Magnus Materia operations occurred during his tenure, but are handled at division level, without requiring direct presidential oversight. When Hojo cites Gast's reports about weapons, Rufus genuinely doesn't know what he's talking about. This timeline explains all the apparent contradictions. Shinra did discover physical evidence of weapons decades before Meteor. They did have documentary evidence from Cetra texts about what weapons were. They did develop active programs to engage with emerging weapons. But this knowledge was fragmented across time, across divisions, across classification levels. No one person or group had complete understanding, and the connections between historical discovery, ancient prophecy, and emerging threat were never fully synthesized until it was too late. Why secrecy mattered, corporate motivations and strategic miscalculations. Understanding what Shinra knew about the weapons is important, but equally important is understanding why the company handled this knowledge the way they did. The decisions to classify the Benora discovery, to limit distribution of Gast's reports, to compartmentalize the Magnus Materia project, all of these had logical reasons behind them that made sense from Shinra's perspective. The most obvious motivation was competitive advantage. If Shinra had discovered evidence that the legendary weapons actually existed, sharing that information publicly would provide strategic intelligence to rivals. Wutai, the primary military and economic competitor, would immediately want to know everything about the weapons, their location, their capabilities, how they might be exploited or defended against. By keeping the Benora discovery classified, Shinra maintained sole knowledge of physical weapon evidence. This gave them a monopoly on studying these creatures, on understanding their composition and structure, on potentially developing countermeasures or exploitation techniques. From a corporate warfare perspective, this secrecy was logical and necessary. There were also political considerations. If news leaked that Shinra had discovered creatures matching ancient warnings about planetary guardians, it would provide ammunition to groups like Avalanche. Environmental activists already argued that Mako extraction was harming the planet. Imagine how much stronger that argument would be if they could say, Shinra has literally found the planet's defense mechanisms and they're keeping it secret. Public knowledge of the weapons could have triggered panic. If people believed that massive creatures capable of destroying cities existed and might wake up, it would destabilize Shinra's carefully controlled society. The company's power rested partly on the perception that they had everything under control, that their technology and military strength made them invincible. Acknowledging the existence of threats beyond their ability to control would undermine that perception. From President Shinra's perspective, the cautious approach to the Benora weapon made sense. Don't provoke it, don't publicize it, maintain observation, but avoid actions that might trigger awakening. This was risk management, containing a potential threat without unnecessarily alarming the population or alerting competitors. The longer the weapon remained dormant, the more this approach seemed validated. The compartmentalization of information within the company served similar purposes. By limiting who knew about the weapons, Shinra reduced the risk of leaks. Fewer people with access to classified information meant fewer potential security breaches. It also prevented panic within the organization. Rank and file, employees didn't need to worry about legendary monsters when they were just trying to do their jobs running reactors and maintaining infrastructure. However, these reasonable-seeming motivations led to strategic miscalculations with catastrophic consequences. By treating the weapons as a public relations problem rather than an existential threat, by focusing on secrecy rather than preparation, Shinra left itself vulnerable to exactly the scenario that eventually occurred. The company never developed comprehensive contingency plans for active weapons because most leadership didn't know they existed. When Sapphire weapon attacked Junon, Shinra responded with improvised tactics rather than prepared strategies. The Sister Ray Mako cannon proved effective, but only because of its enormous power rather than any specific anti-weapon design. Diamond Weapon's assault on Midgar nearly succeeded, and only luck prevented total disaster. If Shinra had taken the weapon threats seriously, they might have made different decisions about Mako extraction. They might have limited reactor construction, modified their operations to minimize planetary damage, or at least developed better defensive capabilities for their installations. Instead, they continued aggressive exploitation, apparently believing they could handle any consequences through military force. The fragmentation of knowledge also prevented Shinra from connecting important patterns. The Magnus Materia project encountered larval weapons at reactor sites, but no one connected this to the fact that Mako extraction was probably provoking the planet to spawn new guardians. The Benora weapon remained dormant near a village, but no one considered that keeping human populations near sealed weapons was dangerous. The ancient texts warned about weapons awakening during planetary crisis, but no one thought summoning meteor might constitute exactly that kind of crisis. From an outside perspective, Shinra's handling of weapon knowledge looks negligent. How could they have physical evidence of planetary defense mechanisms and not take them seriously? How could they continue aggressively exploiting Mako when they knew the planet had the capability to retaliate? But from inside the corporation, with its competitive pressures, political considerations and institutional dynamics, the decisions that led to this negligence probably seemed reasonable at each step. This is one of Final Fantasy VII's most sophisticated critiques of corporate power. The way organizations pursuing rational self-interest at each decision point can end up creating catastrophic outcomes. Shinra's choices about weapon knowledge were individually defensible but collectively disastrous. No one person decided, let's ignore this existential threat. Instead, many people made small decisions about classification, need-to-know access, resource allocation and operational priorities that aggregated into systemic blindness. The irony is that Shinra's obsessive secrecy, meant to protect their competitive position, ultimately made them more vulnerable. If they had shared weapon information more broadly within the organization, if they had coordinated research across divisions, if they had treated ancient warnings as actionable intelligence rather than mythology, they might have been better prepared when the crisis came. Conclusion, the answer, and what it means. So, did Shinra know about the weapons before Meteor? After examining all the evidence, tracing the timeline and analyzing the corporate dynamics, we can finally provide a comprehensive answer. Yes, but in the most fragmented and incomplete way possible. Shinra discovered physical evidence of a weapon beneath Benora decades before Meteor's summoning. They had documentary evidence from Professor Gast's research describing what weapons were. Based on ancient Cetra texts and testimony from Ifalna, they developed active programs to pursue emerging larval weapons and extract Magnus Materia from them. In multiple ways, across multiple timelines, through multiple sources, Shinra acquired knowledge that the weapons existed. But this knowledge was scattered, compartmentalized, and never synthesized into a coherent understanding that could inform strategic planning. The Benora discovery was classified and monitored but not actively studied. Gast's reports existed in archives but weren't disseminated to current leadership. The Magnus Materia project operated in isolation from fundamental research divisions. No single person or group possessed complete information, and the connections between different pieces of evidence were never fully made. This fragmentation meant that when Hojo stood in the northern crater watching the ancient weapons awaken, his surprise was genuine. Not because Shinra had never encountered any evidence of weapons, but because he personally had never fully believed they represented real, immediate threats. When Rufus admitted he'd never seen Gast's reports, it revealed how thoroughly institutional knowledge had been lost despite technically existing somewhere in the company's records. The broader lesson here extends beyond video game lore into how real organizations handle existential threats. Shinra's failure wasn't due to lack of information, it was due to failure to properly process, share, and act on information they possessed. The knowledge existed, but systemic dysfunction prevented it from reaching the right people, at the right times, in the right context. This connects to Final Fantasy VII's environmental themes in subtle but important ways. The weapons represent the planet's ultimate response to exploitation, the point at which industrial damage triggers catastrophic natural retaliation. Shinra's inability to recognize or prepare for this response, despite having multiple warnings and evidence, mirrors real-world patterns of ignoring environmental dangers until it's too late. The claim suggests that this ignorance isn't entirely accidental. There's something about Shinra's very nature as a profit-driven corporation that makes it structurally incapable of taking long-term environmental threats seriously. Even when confronted with evidence that the planet can fight back, even when discovering the literal guardians of planetary health, the company's response is to classify the information, continue exploitation, and assume technology and military force can handle any consequences. From a storytelling perspective, this nuanced answer \U 2013 yes, they knew, but in ways that didn't matter \U 2013 is more interesting than a simple yes or no. It allows for character moments like Hojo's surprise at the northern crater, while maintaining consistency with the expanded lore about Ben-Aura and Magnus Materia. It creates a portrait of corporate dysfunction that feels realistic rather than cartoonish. For players diving deep into Final Fantasy VII's lore, understanding Shinra's fragmented knowledge of the weapons enriches appreciation of the game's worldbuilding. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII isn't just adding random details. It's building a coherent picture of how an organization as large and complex as Shinra could simultaneously know about existential threats while remaining unprepared for them. The question of what Shinra knew about the weapons also invites players to think about what other secrets might exist in the game's world. If knowledge this significant could be lost, compartmentalized or ignored, what else might be hiding in Shinra's archives? What other ancient warnings went unheeded? What other discoveries were classified and forgotten? As we look forward to the final game in the remake trilogy, this understanding of how Shinra handled weapon knowledge becomes relevant again. With timeline changes and fate defiance creating new complications, with the planet spawning larval weapons in response to Sephiroth's manipulations, the question of how Shinra will respond to threats becomes crucial.